Hey everybody, this is Andy Whaley from AG Financial, and I'm here today in the Barna Group offices in beautiful Southern California, hanging out with Roxanne Stone, Editor-in-Chief of Barna. And Barna Group just got done with some amazing research. They did a project called State of the Pastors, and when I looked at that research, I realized there was a lot of great insights for our pastors and for church leaders to be aware of. And so Roxanne was kind enough to meet with me today. And Roxanne, when you and the rest of the Barna Group did this research, there are so many great insights that came out of this. What were some of your favorite or more interesting aha moments through the research?
Sure. Well, kind of when we did the research, we really looked at like 3 areas of just sort of holistic pastoral life. We looked at what we kind of self-leadership, so kind of how pastors are doing in their own lives and with their families and relationships, and then we looked at sort of church leadership, so how are things going with their staff, with boards, with elders, with the congregants, and then sort of cultural leadership, how are they feeling kind of broadly within culture. So within each of those categories, I think in terms of self-leadership, one of the real ahas for us was that pastors are doing really well for the most part. 91% of them say that they're really overall satisfied with their quality of life. The areas where we saw a little bit of trouble, we sort of measured burnout risk,
Sure.
Asking a bunch of different factors. So we did see that about 1 in 3 pastors is at a medium or high risk of burnout, just according to these different factors that we had, and some of those were relational, some of them were financial, some of them were really just tensions within their church, and some of them were spiritual, of course.
Sure.
We also saw probably the biggest aha that we can get into a little bit more is that we've really seen that pastors are aging as a whole. So we looked at Barna, we've tracked pastoral data for a long time, and so if we look over the last 25 years, we've seen the average age of pastors climb from 44 to 54. So we now have more pastors twice as many pastors over the age of 65 as under the age of 45. So this is a big, this is, if you're future casting for the church, right? This is an area of potential crisis. When it comes to church leadership, we saw that that most pastors really love preaching. That's sort of the primary part of their job that they love. But when they talk about sort of where they felt unprepared, the majority of them, the number one thing that they pointed to is they felt unprepared in seminary for counseling. So sort of the pastoral side of being a pastor, working with people. Yeah. And we also saw a lot of them say that they felt unprepared in terms of running the church. So the administrative side of it, the financial side of it, the budgeting, like all of those aspects that, when they became pastors, that wasn't what they were thinking about, right? So, and then when it came to culture, I think the biggest sort of aha was really kind of the diminishing influence that pastors feel like they have and the culture sort of affords to pastors. So we saw only about 1 in 5 people said that they believe pastors are influential. Wow. So that's a low number. And
What the people that were studied to get that number, were those people that attend church or just more general
broad
population?
General population.
Okay.
So
1 in 5?
1 in 5
Wow.
feel that pastors are influential. Same number think that pastors are like a credible source of wisdom. And that number goes down when you ask them, are they a credible source of wisdom on politics?
Sure.
So people are skeptical in some ways of what pastors are sort of teaching from the pulpit. And pastors themselves, only about 1 in 3, so about a third of them actually feel prepared enough to engage in those sensitive cultural conversations with people who disagree with them. So they feel they're hesitant about it as well. And yet we saw some good things in that most people, if they actually know a pastor personally, if they attend a church, 2/3 of them say that they really respect and love their pastor. So it's like
you would actually think it might be more than 2/3, but okay.
So broadly, people are skeptical of pastors, but if they actually know a pastor, they like their pastor,
Sure.
So, and most people believe churches are a benefit to their community. The general population would say, yeah, it's a good thing to have a church within our community. So those are some of the ahas.
No, that's great. So with the areas, you mentioned areas of risk for a pastor, being spiritual, relational, I think you mentioned financial. There are huge opportunities, in my opinion, for church boards or deacons, trustees, whatever you want to call them, to be able to support the pastor, empower that pastor in all these different areas, when applicable. What are some ways or things that boards or trustees should be looking out for when it comes to maybe trying to identify risk for a pastor?
Absolutely. The sort of number one thing that I would say is that in almost every area in our risk metric, and those pastors that are sort of re-identified as being higher risk on that metric, they're all struggling with a sense of calling and identity, and a sense of sort of of faith in a way. So in a lot of ways, if they're feeling unsatisfied with their vocation, if they're feeling dissatisfied with or unsure of their calling, then a lot of the other parts of church work are really wearing on them, and the stress on their families. And pastors are making decent incomes. They're at about average income for their education level, if not slightly above. But even that, when we see pastors who are at higher risk of burnout, like the stresses of finances are on them too. And so in a lot of ways, it seems as if you've sort of lost your spiritual vision or your sense of calling, then all of the other stresses of pastoral life feel much weightier.
Sure.
So I think in a lot of ways what those who are seeking to serve pastors is that's really worth paying attention to, and really encouraging pastors in their sense of calling and in their sense of vocation and in their sense of sort of satisfaction with the work that they're doing in ministry itself. So I think that's one of the number one things. We also saw that pastors, while they're really doing better than the general population in almost every area that we studied, where they perceive that they are, the two areas where they're not, where they're more likely to feel sort of angst or inadequacy around their vocation or calling, and they're more likely to feel mentally and emotionally exhausted. So I think that's, again, the work that pastors do. If they feel incredibly called to their calling, to their vocation, they recognize sort of the weight of it, the high stakes of what they do, because it's like the highest calling in many ways for them.
Absolutely.
And so they're more likely than anybody else to feel inadequate to that calling, because most people maybe don't put that weight of sort of the weight of the world on their job, in a way
like
that
they
pastors do. So we see that, and then we see just this emotional, mental exhaustion again, and in many ways maybe because they felt the counseling side of it, the weight of people bringing like their deepest problems to the pastor. So there is this level of exhaustion. And we also saw that pastors are often lonely. They have most of them have good family relationships with their spouse and their kids, but their sort of extended friend network, within that they sort of feel lonely. And I think that makes a lot of sense too, because maybe their friend network is part of their churches, and so there's that sense, well, I'm your pastor, can I really be your friend? And so I think there's, I think more pastors that can really be encouraged to sort of build up that friend network and support network, if even outside of the church. I think that's a real level of support that a lot of pastors need.
That's a huge point. And I think a lot of us in church don't always think about that, because we have our friend networks and we're doing our things, and we leave church and we go do lunch together, but who's the pastor having lunch with?
Exactly.
So, pastoral health leads to church health, in my opinion. So I love what you said about how trustees can be focusing on some of those different aspects to be looking out for the pastor, understanding some of the things that they're struggling with, dealing with at large, to try to find ways to just encourage and empower that pastor, knowing that leads to healthier churches around the country. There was something that you had mentioned, and it's one of the things that jumped out at me in the research. It was the average, you were talking about the age of the pastors is so much older than in past years when you had benchmarked that, that research area. And wasn't it almost to the tune of like 10 years older on average?
10 years older.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are some of the implications of that? If you take a snapshot, which is what you guys did, of course, of pastors in the U.S. now from an age standpoint. What are the ramifications of some of those older pastors?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're far-reaching. I mean, I think there's some good things where we've seen the average tenure of pastors at churches go up. So where it used to be 4 to 5 years, we've 25 years ago, it's now 10 years. So we're seeing that leads to a lot of stability for a church to have a pastor over a 10-year span. So there's some really good things in that way, but we're also seeing, older pastors they're retiring later, so they're staying longer, just in ministry in general.
And I think we've seen that just with people in
general.
Exactly. When it comes to financial stability, they feel that they can't retire right away.
Exactly.
Sure.
And health, people are healthier longer, so there's so many ways that people are just reasons they're staying in their jobs longer. But that has a huge impact when you're thinking about raising up the next generation of leadership. If they're having to wait until they're in their 30s, 40s, or 50s to get into positions where they're senior pastors, I mean, financially even it's a long time to wait. That's the whole time that you're raising kids, that you're potentially in an associate pastor position, and so you're getting pretty underpaid for your education level, because most pastors have master's degrees, they have seminary degrees, and so I think there's a lot of, that there's some frustration there. And then of course for a church that we're very concerned about millennials and about these sort of younger age groups leaving church. Well, if they're not feeling represented in leadership, if they're feeling, if they're not feeling like there's opportunities for them at the church beyond just attendance, I think that's a big part of it. And senior pastors themselves are saying that 1 in 3 of them is saying that they feel it's harder and harder to find young pastors, to mentor into pastoring. So that kind of goes on both sides. So we're, in part, just the general population changes within the church is reflected in that. We see fewer millennials in church, and so of course we're seeing fewer millennials in pastoral positions, but we're also making it harder and harder for them to become pastors. So that goes both ways. And I think even just some of the dynamics of sort of the general population changes, so things like the fact that we're seeing millennials wait longer and longer to get married, and the fact that we're seeing them wait longer and longer to have kids. Well, the vast majority, 9 in 10 pastors are married, and most of them have kids. And so again, this sort of disconnect from a growing number of the population and being represented by those in the pulpit. So, I think when you look 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we're going to see some kind of crisis of leadership within the church, just availability of people who can be pastors and senior pastors.
I hadn't thought of that. So I can see that. There's a lot of research and amazing ideas and insights on millennials in the church in this. And I know that David and Gabe Lyons have written other books in that regards. So I want to save some of the good information for the book. But this is a book that actually I purchased. You can go to Barna's website and get the State of the Pastors research report and all these great insights that Roxanne's been sharing. You can read more about those. I highly recommend pastors and church leaders that you get a copy of this. Make sure your pastor has it. Make sure the trustees or board members have it. Great insights on how to support pastors in our churches. Roxanne, thanks so much for visiting today and sharing those insights. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.